The year is 2560 BC. The air over the Giza plateau is thick and still. There are no dramatic battles here, no thrilling palace intrigues. This is a story about stillness, about repetition, and about the slow, agonizing application of physics and faith. This is a story about stone. We begin at the foundation, the Great Pyramid of Khufu, which would one day rise higher than any other structure on Earth for nearly 4 millennia. Did not start with a grand fanfare. It began with quiet, obsessive measurement. The master architect, Imunu, wasn't yet concerned with height, but with something far more fundamental, the level. The plateau was a rugged, uneven expanse of rock. The base of this divine structure had to be perfectly horizontal. Imagine the sound, or rather, the lack of it, as the surveying team worked. No clatter of machinery, just the soft whisper of reed mats being unrolled, and the faint, rhythmic plink of a wooden plumb bob meeting the rock. The work was endless and incredibly precise. First, a massive square boundary, several hundred cubits long, was marked out on the desert floor. Its orientation was critical. It wasn't enough for the sides to simply face north, south, east, and west. They had to align perfectly with the stars. The northern boundary, specifically, was adjusted again and again to align with the polar star, a single, fixed point of cosmic stillness in the turning heavens. This alignment alone took weeks of nightly observations, using simple sighting poles and the slow, meticulous passage of time. Once this cosmic square was set, the real leveling began. The foundation rock had to be smoothed, but first, it had to be understood. Thin, shallow canals were cut into the rock's surface, forming a grid over the entire area. These channels were then flooded with water, and simple, honest water revealed the truth of the surface. Where the water pooled deep, the rock was low. Where it was just a shallow film, the rock was high. Then, a team of levelers, armed with the most basic of tools, began the dullest of tasks, bringing every single point of this enormous square down to the exact level of the water's surface. They didn't chip away at the high points quickly. No, they hammered, slowly, using spherical, dolerite pounders, heavy stones used to crush other stones. The sound was a low, steady thud dash thud dash thud, a dull, heavy noise carried on the warm desert air. It was the sound of pure repetition. A man might strike the same piece of rock hundreds of times in a single day, removing only a few millimeters of quartz and feldspar. The work was slow, bone-jarring, and utterly monotonous. Hour after hour, day after day, the men labored. They moved with a slow, deliberate pace, their movements governed by the unforgiving weight of their tools and the density of the limestone. There was no rush. Rush was the enemy of perfection, and the pharaoh demanded permanence. They flattened the surface, centimeter by centimeter, checking their progress not with lasers or scales, but by periodically flooding the channels again, watching where the water lay too thick or too thin. After perhaps 4 or 5 full moons of this slow, leveling work, the foundation was finally deemed ready. A platform, 52,000 square meters in area, was now perfectly flat, perfectly horizontal, and perfectly aligned to the silent, slow rotation of the celestial sphere. This was the base upon which all subsequent layers would rest. But a base requires stones. Our attention now shifts to the quarry, a few kilometers away. Here, the raw material are simple, durable nummulitic limestones being extracted. This stone, containing the fossilized remains of tiny marine organisms millions of years old, is now exposed to the sun. It's hard, but not too hard. It can be worked. The process of extraction is even slower than the leveling. The quarryman first identified the natural fissures and bedding planes in the rock face. They drove dry wooden wedges deep into these cracks. Then, they poured water over the wedges. Not a torrent, but a slow, continuous trickle. The wood began to swell, slowly. A wooden wedge doesn't swell instantly. It absorbs water drop by drop, millimeter by millimeter. This process of absorption is not violent. It's a creeping, inexorable pressure that builds over hours, often an entire day. The silence in the quarry was punctuated only by the drip of water and the occasional groan of the stressed rock. Finally, with a deep, low crack, the stone would split along its natural line, separated by the passive, patient power of wood and water. Once separated, the block had to be shaped. Hundreds of men worked with copper chisels, shaping the rough stone into blocks of approximate uniformity. The sound was a different kind of monotony now. The persistent chink-chink of metal meeting stone, a rhythmic percussion that was constant and unchanging from sunrise to sunset. A single block might weigh 2, 3, even 5,000 pounds. The first finished block, designated for the first outer layer of the southeast corner, was finally ready. A massive, heavy, unyielding parapet to move it. A path had been prepared, not a grand road, but a simple, shallow track, smoothed by the constant passage of men and water. They laid down wooden sledges beneath the block, securing it with thick, braided papyrus rope, and then the pull. The team for this initial, smaller block consisted of perhaps 20 men. They lined up in pairs, each pair gripping the thick rope. They didn't pull quickly. They pulled with a low, unified grunt, coordinating their effort to the slow, monotonous beat of a foreman's drum. HUP ... and ... ha. HUP ... and ... HUP ... ha. The drum beat was slow, perhaps one beat every 4 seconds. The block would only move a foot or two with each pull, grinding slowly, deliberately, over the sand-smoothed path. To reduce friction, a man walked ahead, pouring water or, sometimes milk, a rare luxury onto the path just in front of the sledge runners. The water hissed faintly as the dry desert ground absorbed it, creating a thin, slippery layer of mud. The journey of this first block was slow. 1 kilometer an hour was a good pace. This single block, the very first of 2,300,000, took the entire morning to travel the 3 kilometers from the quarry to the now perfectly leveled foundation. It finally arrived at the edge of the immense, silent square. Here, near the southeast marker, it was guided carefully off the sled, tipped gently, and settled into its preordained position. It was one stone among an eventual multitude, resting perfectly flat on the perfectly flat ground. The sound of its settling was a final, deep thump, absorbed immediately by the earth. And then, the silence returned, broken only by the thud-thud-thud of the levelers, still working on the ramp area, and the distant chink-chink-chink of the quarrymen, shaping the 2,299,999 stones yet to come. Thank you for joining us on this journey back in time. If you found this story of ancient engineering as fascinating as we do, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the past. We'll see you in the next one. The placement of the first stone was not a moment of celebration, but a signal for acceleration, the acceleration of repetition. Now, the rhythm established in the quarry and on the path had to transfer to the construction site itself. The goal was to cover the entire 52,000 square meters of the base platform with the first solid layer of core stones. Each block was essentially the same, rough-cut locally quarried limestone, designed to fit snugly against its neighbors. The men no longer measured the overall squareness of the foundation that was done. Now, they measured the face. Imagine the men kneeling along the edges of the growing square. They held long, thin strings, soaked in ochre dye, taut against the vertical face of the placed blocks. With a snap, the string released, leaving a thin, red guideline on the rock. This line marked the exact, precise angle of the pyramid's future slopan. Unvarying angle of approximately $51.80 degrees. Every block, as it was laid, had to be trimmed and adjusted to meet this line, ensuring the immense structure would ascend with flawless geometry. The sound of the thud-thud-thud from the dollarite pounders now moved from the leveling field to the face of the pyramid itself. Hundreds of men worked simultaneously, their hammers beating out a massive, dry percussion symphony. Thud ... A slight adjustment to the block edge. Thud ... thud ... A fraction of stone removed. SCR AAAP ... the sound of a copper chisel being used to smooth the final surface. This process was repeated nearly 40,000 times for the first layer alone. 40,000 blocks, each one pulled from the quarry, dragged across the plain, guided into position, and then meticulously shaped to meet the unseen, geometric plane. The layer was completed. The men paused for a day of rest, and then they began layer 2. The height of layer 1 was perhaps 1 meter. Standing on it, the view was still the same flat desert. The work ahead was the same as the work behind. To get the blocks for layer 2 onto the top of layer 1, the engineers built the first of what would become mini ramps. This ramp was simple: piled earth, limestone chips, and desert rubble packed hard. It was short, perhaps only 20 meters long, rising slowly to the top of the completed first layer. The pulling crews, the sledgers, now had to exert slightly more effort. They had to fight not just friction, but gravity. The chant changed slightly, incorporating the resistance. HUP ... and ... ha, push. HUP ... ha ... strain. The pace remained the same, one steady beat every 4 seconds. The foreman kept the rhythm slow and deliberate. Speed led to missteps, uneven effort, and broken ropes. Slowness ensured consistency. Block by block, the stones for layer 2 were hauled up this modest incline, one at a time. Each block needed its own 20-man crew, its own sledge, and its own designated water pourer to slick the ramp path. And then, layer 3, and layer 4, and layer 5. The layers were constructed identically. The outer stones, the inner core stones, the packing stones filling the gaps all, were laid and adjusted to the same geometric angle. The height grew slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a plant that only grows when you aren't looking. The mortar mixers, the sound of slurry. As the blocks rose, another crew began its own specialized, monotonous work, the mortar mixers. This team was responsible for creating the gypsum mortar, the binder that would fill the fine gaps between the irregular core stones, providing an extra measure of stability and ensuring a perfectly level plane for the next course. The process started with gypsum rock, a soft, white mineral. It had to be crushed into an exceedingly fine powder. The sound here was different. It was a rhythmic, sandy grind scrape. Imagine dozens of men, sitting cross-legged, using small, handheld millstones. They would place a handful of gypsum rock fragments on a stationary, flat stone and use a smaller, curved stone to roll and grind the fragments. The work was dusty. Every hour, the men were covered in a fine, white powder. Their movements were repetitive and circular, their arms moving in a continuous, hypnotic loop. Grind, scrape, ... grind, ... scrape, ... Once the gypsum was a fine, dusty powder, it was taken to the mixing pits. These were simple depressions lined with clay, filled with water, and sometimes a small amount of natron salt to accelerate the setting. The mixing was physical and demanding, but boringly repetitive. Men used long, wooden paddles, stirring the milky slurry in wide, slow circles. The mixture had to be absolutely smooth, without lumps or pockets of dry powder. Slosh, ... stir, ... slosh, ... stir, ... This was the sound of the thick, white liquid turning in the clay bowls. It was a heavy, wet sound, distinct from the dry sounds of the stoneworkers. When the mortar was ready, it was carried in large, rough pottery jars up to the current working level. The mortar applicator crew would receive a new block, already adjusted to the correct angle. Before the block was settled fully, a thick layer of the gypsum slurry would be poured onto the layer below. The application was messy but controlled, poured from the jar onto the rock face and then spread quickly with a smooth, flat piece of wood. The sound of the application was a thick, wet shluup ... followed by a gentle, wooden tap 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 as the new block was nudged into place. The mortar would squeeze out from the seams, a slow, oozing process. And excess material was quickly scraped away and tossed into the ever-growing ramp of rubble nearby. For layer 40, the rhythm was exactly the same as for layer 2. The sledges had to pull their blocks slightly higher and slightly further up a now taller, wider ramp. The angle of the ramp remained deliberately gentle, perhaps $1 in $10, to ensure the maximum number of blocks could be moved with the minimum possible strain. Layer 40 was placed perhaps 35 meters above the original ground. When the men looked out, they could see the vast, shimmering desert stretching further than before. Yet, when they looked up at the completed structure, they were still standing on a wide, low, flat plateau. The upward curve of the pyramid was almost invisible at this height, the monument still feeling more like a massive, square hill than a peak reaching for the stars. The sun rose and set, painting the monotonous walls first gold, then blue, and then nothing. And the work continued. The pyramid rose, and with every 10 new courses of stone, the single, great ramp that snaked up the northern side had to grow alongside it. This process of ramp expansion was a job entirely separate from the stone laying, yet it demanded thousands of hands, and was perhaps the most relentlessly boring task on the plateau. It was a job of earth, not stone, of soft dust and hard packing, a constant, low-grade battle against gravity and the slow, inevitable shifting of sand. The ramp had to maintain its gentle, unhurried gradient, the $1 in $10 slope that ensured maximum efficiency and minimum risk of breaking the thick papyrus ropes. As the pyramid's height increased by 1 meter, the ramp had to extend horizontally by 10 meters. This meant the ramp grew longer, and it also had to grow wider to accommodate the two streams of traffic, blocks moving up, and empty sledges and men moving down. Imagine the workers dedicated solely to this expansion. They were the basket carriers. Their daily ritual began with filling thick, woven baskets with materials scraped from the surrounding desert: clay, pulverized limestone chips from the quarry waste, sand, and fragments of discarded mortar. The shovel was a simple wooden paddle, and the sound it made was a dry, continuous shek-shek as it dragged through the loose material. The basket carriers would lift the heavy loads, each basket holding perhaps 50 pounds of dense, dry earth, and begin the walk. They moved slowly, in single file, marching along the established, packed sections of the ramp and delivering their loads to the newly marked, uncompacted area at the ramp's crest. The delivery was simple. The basket was inverted, and the earth fell out with a dull, muffled humph. This process was repeated hour after hour. SCHHH-SCHHH-SCHHH-SCHH ... humph. Walk back ... SCHHHH-SCHHH-SCHHH ... Walk back. They did this perhaps 20 times in a morning, 50 times in a day. The sound of their steady, bare feet on the packed earth was a soft, continuous tap-tap, a sonic counterpoint to the distant chant of the sledgers. Once the loose earth was deposited, another team, the packers, took over. Using heavy, blunt wooden mallets, and sometimes simple wooden poles, they would pound the fresh fill. The purpose was not to break rock, but simply to force out the air and water, turning the loose mixture into a firm, stable road surface. The sound of the packers was a steady, dull, insistent pat-pat-pat. It was the sound of persistence over time. A packer might strike the same square meter of ramp 50 times before moving on to the next. The area was enormous, and their work was never done, for the ramp was always growing. The ramp builders were also responsible for its surface. The top layer, where the sledges ran, required a mixture of Nile clay and water to be constantly applied and smoothed, creating the slick, muddy film necessary to reduce friction. A crew of men walked the ramp all day, dragging wide, flat wooden scrapers across the surface. The sound was a heavy, wet squelch, 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 the mud reforming and drying in the sun, only to be mixed, smoothed, and wet again the next hour. The surface was never perfect, only perpetually, boringly maintained. The copper shop, the quiet sound of sharpening. A short distance from the noisy, dusty heart of the construction lay a sheltered area, a long, low tent that housed the copper shop. Here, the noise changed entirely. The Great Pyramid was built, not with iron, but with copper tools, which were soft and quickly blunted by the hardcore limestone. Every few hours, the quarrymen and the stone dressers sent their tools, the chisels, the small saws, the drill tips down to the shop to be renewed. The work here was performed by the metalsmiths, but their task was not exciting creation. It was monotonous repair. The primary sound was the screeus of a whetstone. Imagine a line of smiths, each sitting before a flat, coarse sharpening stone. They held the dull copper chisel or blade steady and began the long, repetitive process of rubbing the metal against the abrasive stone. The motion was forward, back, executed with steady pressure, always maintaining the correct, precise bevel on the cutting edge. This required utter concentration and complete physical boredom. The smith was not shaping the stone. The smith was simply submitting the copper to the stone's abrasive will. Scree. Pause for inspection. Scree. A tool might require 100 strokes on one side, then 100 on the other. The work generated a fine, gray dust, powdered stone, mixed with minute flecks of copper. The air was cool in the tent, a contrast to the sun outside, but it was heavy with the metallic, dusty smell of the grinding. Sometimes, the smiths had to cold hammer the copper. Copper work hardens, meaning it becomes brittle after repeated impacts with the stone. To restore its toughness, the smith would lay the blade on a flat, heavy anvil and strike it gently with a small, round stone hammer. The sound of the cold hammering was a clean, high-pitched, metallic clink, clink, clink. It was a delicate sound, completely different from the heavy thud of the dolerite pounders. The smith would strike the same point gently, then slightly shift the hammer, striking again, working slowly down the length of the dull edge, ensuring the metal was dense and ready to hold an edge. Once hammered, it was back to the whetstone for the final, tedious sharpening. Clink dash, clink dash, clink dot dot dot, scree. The tools arrived dull. They left sharp. The smiths knew that within a few hours of use, the tools would be back. Their work was a perpetual, unchanging cycle of dullness, renewal, and back to dullness again. It was the necessary, boring cycle of maintenance that allowed the rest of the massive, slow project to proceed. The sun climbed higher, moving slowly over the immense square base of the pyramid. The pat of the ramp builders blended with the distant hup, and ha, strain of the sledgers. And underneath it all, the gentle, constant scree of the men who kept the edges sharp, while the Great Pyramid grew outward and upward with its repetitive layers of limestone. Another group of workers was engaged in the opposite, and arguably more isolated, form of monotony, tunneling downward. At a point roughly 17 meters north of the pyramid's true center, 2 rows of facing blocks had been meticulously placed to begin the structure's most crucial internal space, the descending passage. This passage had a specific, unvarying purpose. It pointed, with deliberate, silent accuracy, toward the location of the circumpolar stars, those that never set in a year of its construction. To achieve this alignment, the tunnel had to descend at an angle of 24 degrees and 34 minutes. This was not a gentle slope. It was a fixed, steep, and unyielding descent into the dark heart of the Giza rock. The work of the tunnelers was different from that of the quarrymen. The quarrymen split rock along its natural seams. The tunnelers had to destroy the solid, natural bedrock itself, chipping away inch by inch. Their tools were simple and heavy, the same spherical dolerite pounders used for leveling, but here, they were wielded in an extremely confined space. Imagine the work, crew only for men, could fit comfortably in the narrow, 1.05 meter square passage. They worked by the flickering, greasy light of small sesame oil lamps, whose weak flame cast long, nervous shadows that danced slightly with every swing. The sound inside the tunnel was utterly muffled to the outside world, but deafeningly heavy within. It was a relentless, choked thud-thudding, heavier and closer than the sound of work outside. The lead man, on his knees, would swing the dolerite pounder, impacting the limestone face. The resulting debris was not a clean block, but dust, chips, and pulverized rock. This powder, gray and fine, filled the air instantly, coating the men's faces, hair, and lungs. The pace was agonizingly slow. For every 4 hours of intense pounding, the crew might advance the tunnel by only 30 centimeters. They were carving a path 105 meters long through solid earth. This was an act of faith measured in millimeters. Every few feet, the foreman would interrupt the pounding for a measurement. The geometry of the angle could not be compromised. A specially constructed wooden A-frame, calibrated to the exact 24 feet 34 inches slope, was lowered. A heavy lead plumb bob was hung from the apex. The line had to fall perfectly against the lower leg of the A-frame. Thudding stopped. Silence. The sound of a chain being lowered. Clink, clink, clink. The lead bob settles. Silence. The foreman squints at the line. It is straight. Thudding resumed. The most repetitive and boring task of this operation was not the pounding, but the waste removal. For every cubic foot of tunnel they advanced, approximately 120 pounds of pulverized rock had to be removed. The tunnel was too steep and too narrow for sledges. The spoil had to be carried. A second team, the basket haulers, worked in the darkness behind the pounders. They would shovel the gray, heavy dust into small, woven rush baskets, each one designed to hold perhaps 15 pounds of material. Once filled, the hauler would place the basket on his shoulder and begin the long, steep climb back up the dark passage, emerging from the ground level, opening onto the sunny plateau. Shuffle, scrape, the sound of the basket dragging on the tunnel floor. Heavy, strained breathing. The hauler fights the incline. Shuffle, shuffle, scrape. A man might carry a basket of waste out of the tunnel and dump it near the northern face. He would descend back into the darkness, fill his basket, ascend again, and dump it. Carry, dump, return fill, carry, dump, return fill. This cycle was repeated hundreds of times a day. The basket haulers were never pounding rock, never measuring stars, never seeing the sun except in brief, dusty flashes at the mouth of the tunnel. They were simply the unending conveyor of pulverized waste. The descending passage continued its deliberate, steep path into the earth, eventually passing entirely through the natural bedrock and entering the soft, dry clay layer beneath. When the tunnelers finally broke through to the clay, the sound changed dramatically. The heavy, sharp thud of the stone pounders ceased, replaced by the soft, wet schlock, schlock, schlock of simple wooden shovels moving the damp, yielding clay. The work became physically easier, but even more silent and isolating, as the heavy stone walls muffled the sound of the outside world completely. Down here, 30 meters below the surface, nothing moved quickly, nothing changed. There was only the sound of chipping, the scraping of rock, and the slow, heavy breathing of men who knew the path ahead was dark, straight, and perpetually, agonizingly downhill. While the majority of the monument was made of local limestone, the most sacred and structurally critical components, the burial chambers, and the complex relieving system above them required the hardest known material, red Aswan granite. This stone was not found a few kilometers away, but over 800 kilometers to the south, near the first cataract of the Nile. Transporting it introduced a new logistical system built entirely on the passive, repetitive power of the river current. The work began in the Aswan quarry, where the stone was infinitely harder than the nummulitic limestone of Giza. Copper chisels were useless against this dense, igneous rock. The method was entirely different, slower, and even more relentlessly tedious. The granite pounders did not use sharp tools. They used only brute, repetitive force against an unyielding material. Imagine a crew of 5 men working on a single, massive block destined for the king's chamber. They stood in a line, each holding a spherical dolerite pounder, a heavy stone up to 12 pounds in weight. They did not strike the block once to cleave it. They struck the surface thousands of times to pulverize it, grain by grain. The sound here was a high-pitched, dull thunk-thunk, a noise that carried surprisingly little distance, quickly absorbed by the surrounding hard rock. It was a focused, sharp, metallic impact, relentless and unending. The men worked in a rhythmic stagger, ensuring constant impact on the same line of rock. A man could pound granite for an entire day, feeling the vibration travel up his arm, and remove only a few teaspoons of rock powder. They did this for weeks to separate a single, monolithic beam. The granite was then shaped, not by chipping, but by the same brutal, patient thunking, ensuring every face was flat and true. Once extracted and roughly shaped, the massive block weighing perhaps 50 tons had to be moved to the loading basin. This required a level of collective, slow exertion unseen at Giza. The granite block was placed on a massive, reinforced wooden sledge. Hundreds of workers were required for the pull. The sound of the movement was not the chant of the sledgers, but the sound of pure high-stress friction and strain. Grind, the weight of the granite on the rollers. Eek, the sound of strained, twisted papyrus rope. Thump thump. The block passes slowly over a new wooden roller being inserted beneath the sledge. The block was moved perhaps 100 meters a day, inch by agonizing inch, until it reached the edge of the water basin. The passive transport, loading the barges, was a patient waiting game, dictated by the Nile itself. The barges were not fast, streamlined ships. They were flat-bottomed, heavy wooden carriers, built robustly to bear immense weight. The barge was floated into the basin and secured. Ropes were attached to the granite block, now suspended over the water's edge. At high tide, the crew waited. As the tide receded, the barge would settle slightly. More ropes were attached, and the granite block was slowly lowered onto the barge deck, using a combination of wooden levers and carefully placed sand pits that were slowly excavated from beneath the block. The sound of the loading was the creak of stressed timber and the soft, dry squish of sand being slowly scraped away beneath a lever's fulcrum. Once loaded, the voyage began. Unlike the Giza workers, who had to constantly fight friction and gravity, the transport crews were governed by the monotonous power of the current. The crew stood on the deck of the heavily laden barge. Their job was not to pull or push, but to wait and maintain. The massive central steering oar, lashed to the stern, had to be constantly tended to keep the slow, heavy barge centered in the fastest part of the current. The only continuous sound for the next 3 weeks was the lap-lap of the Nile water against the heavy hull. It was a passive, rhythmic sloshing that defined the journey. A crew member's day consisted of hours of silence, occasionally broken by the slow, squeaking adjustment of the steering oar. The helmsman shifts the oar. They pass thousands of identical riverbank scenes, the same mud brick villages, the same groves of palm trees, the same low, green fields. Nothing changed quickly. The journey was an exercise in pure patience, the slow, imperceptible movement of a floating 50-ton weight northwards, delivered by nature. The final haul. Finally, after 3 weeks of the river's monotonous delivery, the barge arrived at the Giza construction harbor, a specially dredged basin connected to the rising waters of the Nile. The unloading process was the reverse of the loading, slow, careful, and filled with the grating sound of wood on wood. Once the block was finally resting on the muddy, prepared dockside, the final journey to the pyramid's base began. These granite blocks were too precious and too heavy to be pulled up the temporary construction ramp with the core stones. Instead, they were hauled over a specially prepared, permanent road that connected the harbor basin to the site. The sound returned to that of pure terrestrial friction, the relentless squeal of the heavy sledge runners being dragged over the slick, caland water-soaked road. Eek, hup, hop, push. The granite moved agonizingly slow, a symbol of the king's power making its final, reluctant journey to the center of the earth. When a granite block was finally laid in place within the subterranean chamber, the first of the permanent, non-limestone stones, it was not lowered quickly. It was nudged, leveraged, and carefully maneuvered into place, a process taking an entire day. The final sound of the granite settling in the dark, cold chamber was a dense, muted thud, heavier and more final than any limestone block before it. The sound echoed briefly in the stone-lined passage, a small, deep sound swallowed by the great silence of the rock. The granite was now home, waiting for the millions of tons of limestone that would eventually cover it. But the boring work was only just beginning. The moment the construction reached the third course of core stone, the casing stone operation began. These blocks were arguably the most important element of the pyramid's surface. They were the fine, pale white Tura limestone, imported specifically for its dazzling, smooth finish. It was this layer that would give the pyramid its famous mirror-like gleam under the desert sun. The blocks were quarried from the cliffs across the Nile at Tura, a much shorter journey than the granite, but still requiring transport across the river on barges. The Tura quarrymen were not pounders, they were cutters. They sought blocks with the highest purity and the fewest natural imperfections. Their process relied on careful sawing, not brutal impact. They used large, copper salsam over 3 meters long, often fitted with abrasive sand or quartz grit to help cut through the dense stone. The sound of the Tura quarry was a grating, metallic grish-grish, a sound that was far less aggressive than the thud of the local quarry, but more continuous and piercing. Imagine 2 men, one at each end of the massive copper saw, working it back and forth across the Tura limestone face. Their rhythm had to be perfectly synchronized, the pressure constant, the angle unvarying. They might spend an entire week sawing through a single, large block before it was ready for final shaping. The objective was a perfectly flat surface, and the sawing had to leave a plain surface that minimized the final polishing work. The precision polishers, once the Tura blocks arrived at the Giza site, they were routed to the dressing area. They were not hammered, they were smoothed. This work required the polishing crew, a specialized team dedicated to repetitive, mind-numbing friction. The polisher's job was to take the rough-sawn face and make it mathematically perfect. They worked on the side faces of the block that would abut its neighbor, and the inclined surface that would face outward. They used flat, smooth stones, often made of schist or fine-grained sandstone, a slurry of abrasive quartz, sand mixed with water. The sound was a low, sibilant, the sound of stone eating stone at a microscopic level. It was the quietest, most concentrated form of labor on the entire site. A polisher would kneel over the block, applying the wet sand and rubbing the flat stone back and forth, hundreds of times, then stopping to check the surface. The check was performed with a wooden straightedge, a perfectly flat beam that might be 5 feet long. The straightedge was laid across the polished face. If even a sliver of light showed between the wood and the stone, the polisher had to return to the end till the gap vanished. He would polish for an hour, check the straightedge, find a microscopic deviation near the center, and spend another hour polishing only that specific spot, his motions slow, measured, and unchanging. This process was repeated for all 4 side faces and the outer surface of every single casing stone. Task that might take a single polisher an entire week per block. The agony of the perfect fit. The true monotony began when the finished casing block was ready for placement on the pyramid face. The challenge was not just setting the block, but ensuring that the gap between the new block and its already placed neighbor was almost non-existent. The block, still weighing several tons, was hauled up a separate, clean ramp reserved only for casing stones and granite. It was placed near its final position, but not quite settled. The casing foreman, armed with his straight edge and a set of plumb lines, watched the fitting crew. The block was lowered onto a bed of extremely thin, white gypsum mortar slurry, so fine it acted more like a hydraulic fluid than a glue. The fitting crew's job was now the most boring form of pulling imaginable. They had to use ropes to gently pull and push the multi-ton block sideways, horizontally, in tiny, incremental movements to achieve the perfect joint. The foreman would call out, "A hair to the east." The sledgers, tired from the upward haul, now had to exert massive effort to move the block, perhaps 3 millimeters. The block would shift. The foreman would recheck the joint gap using a thin piece of papyrus. The papyrus had to be physically unable to slip into the gap between the 2 enormous blocks, too far, back 1 millimeter, to the west. The crew would have to reposition the ropes, take a fresh pull, and move the entire massive weight back 1 single millimeter. The sound was a low, straining grind as the huge stone moved almost imperceptibly on its thin mortar bed. They might spend half a day on one block repeating the cycle of adjust, pull, stop, measure, adjust. Pull, stop, measure, moving the giant piece of white stone, less than an inch overall, until the joint vanished and the two surfaces were one seamless, perfect plane. Once perfected, the block was left to settle, its neighbors ensuring its position was fixed forever. The polisher would then return one last time for the final finishing touch, polishing the outer surface of the joint line itself, erasing the seam from sight. The final sound of the casing stone operation was the soft tap-tap of the polisher, gently wiping away the remaining gypsum dust, preparing the flawless white face to reflect the sun in perfect, blinding monotony. The pharaoh's monument was built not only with stone and precision, but with bread and water. The workforce numbered in the tens of thousands, and every single day, the vast, boring work of the construction site required an equally vast, boring flow of lifeblood, sustenance. If the flow stopped for one single day, the stone-moving machine would seize up. This work belonged to the logistics teams, who dealt not with monuments, but with perishable goods, mud, and dust. The water carriers. The sound of sloshing water was the most critical resource. The Nile was hundreds of meters away, and Giza was a hot, dusty place. Thousands of gallons were needed daily for drinking, for mixing mortar, and for slicking the ramps. The water carriers formed a continuous, slow-moving human chain from the river's edge, up the established paths to the workers' barracks, and then up to the current working level of the pyramid. Their tools were simple: a wooden yoke and two heavy clay jars or thick animal skin water bags. The work began at dawn and ended at dusk. The characteristic sound of this crew was the constant, low-frequency, slosh-slosh of water shifting inside its container. It was the sound of necessary waste and endless motion. Imagine a carrier walking the uphill path. The weight was significant, perhaps 80 pounds of water, yoke, and container. Their pace was regulated by the weight and the risk of spillage. A fast pace led to waste. A slow pace was inefficient. They found a medium, relentless, monotonous stride, a short, sighing grunt. Midway up the incline, at the top of the ascent, the water was dumped into a centralized collection cisterna process marked by the deep, glugging sound of a large volume of water being quickly poured. Glll. Then, they turned immediately around and walked a long, empty descent back to the river, their containers now light and silent, only to return to the sloshes, climb again. A water carrier might make this trip 30 times in a day, covering a total distance of 15 miles, always performing the same ascent, the same descent, and hearing the same sound of sloshing water, an auditory metronome of their unchanging task. The millstone grinders, the sound of abrasion. The second critical supply was bread, the staple of the workers' diet, made from emmer wheat. Before it could be baked, the tough grain had to be milled into flour. This was done every night and every morning in the baking compound. The millstone grinders, mostly women, but also crews of men, performed the most audibly boring labor, the grinding of stone against stone. They used simple saddle querns, a large, concave stationary stone, and a smaller, elongated rubbing stone. The grinder knelt, placed a handful of grain on the concave stone, and then used her full body weight to push the heavy rubbing stone back and forth. The sound was a dry, continuous, the high-pitched sound of millions of tiny grit particles attacking the tough hull of the wheat. The motion was a slow, exhausting, horizontal rocking, repeated thousands of times, an endless forward push, a backward pull. The dust was pervasive, not white gypsum dust, but thick brown flour dust mixed with granite grit shed from the millstones. This grit inevitably contaminated the flour, leading to the worn, pitted teeth found in every worker's skull. The grinders literally ground their own bodies as they ground the grain. The work was necessary for every single person on site. Background sound in the encampment, a relentless, dry noise that never stopped while the sun was up. The ration stewards, the rhythmic thump. Finally, there was the distribution, the boring bureaucracy of feeding the masses. The workers were organized into teams, and each day they were entitled to the exact same ration: loaves of bread, portions of dried fish or meat, and most importantly, a fixed amount of beer, a thick, nutritious liquid. The ration stewards managed the line. They were not imposing, just meticulous. The queue was long, slow, and repetitive. The steward's work was entirely defined by the methodical sound of a measured item hitting a hand, thump. A worker would present his token. The steward would take a set loaf and place it in the worker's open palm, thump. The steward would ladle a specific volume of beer into the worker's bowl, glug glug glug. The steward would count out the dried fish, tap, dash, tap, dash, tap. And then, the next man stepped forward, thump. The loaf, glug, glug. The beer, tapped, tap, tap. The fish. This was repeated for hours, thousands of identical interactions. There was no conversation, no variation, just a slow, steady procession of hands, tokens, and the rhythmic thump of the day's required sustenance being delivered. The entire process was boring, precise, and necessary. The internal clockwork of the pyramid machine. The year is late, marked by the slightly cooler dryness of the pre-flood season. The limestone machine, having been fed its daily ration of grain and water, continues its slow ascent. But the men who move the stone are nothing without the tools that allow the movement. The wooden sledges that bear the blocks, the rollers that reduce friction, and the thousands of cubits of rope that provide the collective strength. This is the chapter of the fixers, the men whose success is measured not by how high the pyramid grows, but by how few times the work stops. Their contribution is not additive, is subtractive, reducing the friction and removing the breaks that perpetually threaten the project's momentum. The carpenter's yard, the repair of the sledge. The carpenter's yard was located far enough from the pyramid base to be spared the dust of the quarry, but close enough to the main ramp for quick repairs. Here, the noise was not the loud percussion of stone, but the soft, rhythmic sound of wood on wood. The patient process of healing the equipment that friction constantly tried to destroy. The heart of the yard was the sledge repair crew. A wooden sledge, even one protected by a water-slicked path, suffered constant abuse. The runners, the pieces of wood that slid along the ground, were perpetually gouged, split, and worn down by sharp stone fragments and abrasive sand. Every night, dozens of sledges were hauled into the yard for inspection. The work of the carpenter was boring and detail-oriented first. The sledge was turned over with a low, heavy thump onto the packed earth. The repairman would kneel beside it, inspecting every inch of the runners. If the damage was minor, the process was simple: sanding. The carpenter used a rough piece of sandstone, or sometimes a piece of sharkskin, and began to rub the damaged runner. The goal was not quick removal, but patient smoothing, bringing the wood back to a state where it would not splinter and lock a block in place. The sound was a soft, continuous she, a dry, hissing whisper that went on for hours. The carpenter's arm moved in a long, repetitive arc, back and forth, back and forth. He would repeat the motion until the wood was smooth to the touch, pausing only to run a calloused palm over the surface to check for irregularities. If the damage was severe, a deep gouge or a large splinter, the carpenter was faced with the monotonous task of patching. He would carefully carve a custom-shaped piece of tough acacia wood, ensuring it fit perfectly into the damaged area. The piece was secured using animal hide glue and small, sharp wooden dowels. The sound of the doweling was a quiet, controlled tap 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 of a small, bronze mallet driving the wooden peg into the joint. The striking had to be precise, firm enough to set the peg, but gentle enough not to split the already weakened wood. When the repair was finished, the patch had to be sanded again, seamlessly integrating the new wood with the old. The sledge would then be rolled aside, ready for the next day's grinding labor, only to return the next evening with new damage in a different place. The cycle of destruction and patient, repetitive repair was endless. The rope makers, the consumption of fiber, the power that moved the stone was human, but the medium was the rope. The immense friction and stress of dragging 2-ton blocks constantly frayed, stretched, and broke the papyrus and palm fiber ropes. The site required a near-constant, industrial output of replacement rope, and the rope maker's job was pure, monotonous repetition. The rope yard was filled with the acrid, earthy smell of wet papyrus reed and the dry, grassy scent of twisted palm fiber. The core work was twisting. This required 2 men and a specialized, hand-cranked spinning wheel, or sometimes just a simple hook attached to a belt. The first rope maker fed the raw, pliable fiber into the process, ensuring the tension was steady. The second rope maker, often using the crank, turned the wheel. The purpose of the turning was to take the loose, individual strands of fiber and twist them into a dense, unyielding cable. The sound of the turning was a loud, dry, continuous whir-a-click, whir-a-click. The motion of the cranker was a simple, circular pump of the arm, thousands of rotations a day. His focus was not on the speed, but the consistency of the tension. Too fast, and the rope would snap. Too slow, and the rope would be slack and useless. Once a single strong strand was twisted, it had to be laid with 2 or 3 other identical strands to form the final cable. This laying process created the counter-twist that locked the fibers together, giving the rope its strength. The final product had to be measured usually in units of the royal cubitant, then coiled for immediate use. The rope makers lived in fear of the fray. Any break or inconsistency meant hours of work lost, and the consequence of a broken rope during a block haul was severe potential accident that could injure a dozen men and delay the placement of a keystone. Thus, the work was slow, methodical, and obsessively consistent. Every rope was a result of endless, identical twists, turns, and measures. The roller runners, the cycle of retrieval, the most thankless and repetitive job of movement, belonged to the roller runners. The crew responsible for the wooden rollers used beneath the sledges. The ancient engineers understood that rolling resistance was far less than sliding friction. As a massive block on a sledge began its agonizingly slow ascent up the ramp, wooden rollers logs perhaps a foot in diameter were constantly being placed beneath the front of the sledge and retrieved from the back. The roller runner's task was a pure cycle of physical monotony. Fetch, place, wait, retrieve. Imagine a line of sledges ascending the main ramp. A team of runners worked alongside one sledge. Place. A runner would race ahead a few yards, lie prone, and carefully push a roller into the mud beneath the rising sledge. Runners, he had to ensure the roller was perfectly perpendicular to the direction of travel to prevent the block from skewing. The sound was a soft, wet schlock as the roller settled into the slick mud. Wait. The runner would stand, step aside, and wait for the multi-ton block to slowly, gratingly roll over his roller. The sound of the block passing was a low, heavy growl and, accompanied by the muffled hup and push of the haulers. Retrieve. As the sledge passed entirely over the roller, the runner would immediately bend down, grab the roller, and pull it out of the muddy, trampled area. The retrieval was accompanied by the soft thump of the log hitting the earth. Repeat. The runner would then sprint ahead of the moving sledge, carrying the recovered roller, to lay it down again at the front, continuing the endless cycle. The runner's entire day was spent in this relentless, back-and-forth relay, carrying heavy wooden logs on the wet, slippery ramp, always keeping pace with the agonizingly slow movement of the stone above. A single block might be 15 feet long. A runner might need to retrieve and replace 50 rollers for a block to travel just 100 yards. They were the constant, silent energy transfer system, converting raw human strength into smooth, upward movement. The runner's muscles were perpetually burning, their legs never stopping. Their attention always fixed on the front of the block where the next roller was needed, and the back where the last roller had to be reclaimed. Their work was invisible in the final monument, yet every millimeter of the pyramid's height was a testament to the thousands of times they bent, lifted, ran, and placed. The construction ramp, now immensely long, snaked up the northern side like a vast, brown scar, reaching 140 meters into the sky. The pyramid itself, though not yet complete, was already taller than any structure man had ever conceived. Up here, near the summit, the work became less about brute force and more about the tedious, repeated application of geometry. The sheer scale of the labor force fell away. The tens of thousands of haulers and pounders were now tiny specks on the plain below. The only people who worked at this height were the surveyors and the most elite casing stone fitters, the few dozen men responsible for the final millimeter by millimeter convergence of the entire monument. Up here, the primary enemy was the wind, the steady, persistent desert wind, which barely registered at ground level, buffeted the summit, disturbing the air, and constantly threatening the accuracy of the tools. The surveyor's main task was the daily, monotonous angle check. Every morning, before any stone was laid, the master surveyor would supervise the placement of the A-frame template. This was a massive wooden jig, calibrated to the pyramid's required 51-51 slope. It was placed against the face of the highest completed course of casing stone. Then came the plumb line. A heavy-weighted bronze bob was hung from the apex of the template. Due to the constant breeze, the line never settled instantly. It would swing, slowly and lazily, for minutes. The surveyor stood in absolute silence, waiting for the oscillation to die down. Wait, wait, the wind whistles around the summit. Wait, when the line finally settled, it had to fall perfectly against a mark on the template's base. If it was even a hairbreadth off, it indicated that the stone layers had slipped, and the face had to be tediously hammered back into angle. This was a rare, but catastrophic delay. The repetition of the check was agonizing. They would move the template 5 feet along the edge and check the angle again and again and again. 100 measurements around the perimeter of the highest course, every single day. As the pyramid tapered, the working platform shrank. Each new course of stone was slightly smaller than the last. The work was an exercise in diminishing returns, using massive effort to move stones across a vast distance, only to place them in an ever-shrinking space. The final alignment, the most critical moment, was the preparation of the final platform. The surveyors had to ensure the top course of stone, which would receive the capstone, the Ben Bonnet, was perfectly square, perfectly level, and exactly the right size. A small platform, perhaps 6 meters square. They spent days, not hours, on this single course. They were not only checking the level with water and lines, but rechecking the orientation, using sighting poles. They had to ensure that the small square at the very top was still oriented exactly due north, aligned with the stars, just as the original foundation had been years before. The foreman's instructions were now whispered, not chanted. The proximity to the capstone demanding a reverence for the final act of construction. Level the southwest corner, 1 millimeter only. Check the line. Priest of Thoth. Wait for the wind. The last few granite blocks of the capstone core were hauled up the immense ramp. The journey was slow, taking an entire day for a single block to reach the summit, pulled by the most specialized crew. Finally, the small, perfectly polished capstone, likely covered in a sheath of electrum gold and silver, was hauled up. It was light compared to the core stones, but its placement was the culmination of every boring, repetitive act that came before. The massive crowd below fell silent. The capstone was lifted with the final, heavy pull of the last ropes, maneuvered onto the small, prepared platform, and settled into its position. The final sound of the Great Pyramid of Khufu was not the shout of triumph, but the gentle thud of the final stone settling into its place. The thousands of thudding hammers, the schlock of the mud runners, the whirr-click of the rope makers, the continuous slosh, slosh, and slosh of the water carriers, ceased. The structure was complete. It stood not as a monument to action, but as a monument to stillness, geometry, and the victory of relentless, collective monotony over the chaos of the desert. The long, boring work was over.